It was supposed to be just another weekend, just another drunken day at home, shut off from the world. But that morning, as the sun barely filtered through the heavy curtains, and the remnants of last night's chaos lingered in the air, a single knock on the door shattered our uneasy peace. In our small, isolated town, visitors are rare, especially strangers. What followed was a series of events that turned an already broken home into a nightmarish trap with nowhere to hide from the unknown figure lurking just outside. Looking back now, I know that knock was more than a simple disturbance. It was the beginning of something far darker and far more frightening than I could have imagined. And so, this is where my story begins. 2 years ago, during a period of my life that I now barely recognize, I was married to my husband, Ethan. We had been married for less than a year, but our relationship had already become something dark and twisted. What had once been playful drinking had turned into full-blown alcoholism for us both. And worse yet, Ethan's drunkenness often took a violent turn. I'd been enduring his outbursts for months, and we'd both slipped into a destructive cycle, trapped in a house that belonged to his mother, isolated from everyone who might have helped. Ethan and I were living on our last bits of savings, far too intoxicated and detached to work or even leave the house most days. Instead, we filled our days with booze, surrounded by the smell of stale beer and the blare of an old TV that we used to drown out the silence. The house itself seemed like it was slowly decaying around us. The paint was peeling, the floors creaked, and every door had dents from the times Ethan had tried to force his way back in after I'd locked him out. That morning, I'd managed to lock Ethan out after another of his violent episodes, but he'd kicked his way back in within an hour. The side door, the one I'd finally had repaired, was my last hope at any real security. The front door was so damaged that we had to rely on a cheap anti-break-in stick that Ethan's mother had given us. Not that it offered much protection. The lock barely latched, and the door frame was warped from Ethan's repeated attempts to break it down. It was early Sunday morning, around 11 a.m. Ethan and I had been up since the previous night, drinking steadily. We were sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by empty bottles, with the TV blaring some old rock music station. My head was spinning, and the house was thick with the stench of alcohol. I was on the edge of slipping into an exhausted sleep when a hard, deliberate knock pounded on the front door. My heart jumped. In our state, we were in no condition to have visitors. I felt a wave of anxiety, wondering if Ethan's mother had come by to check on us, or worse, if the police had shown up. It wouldn't be the first time the neighbors had called for noise complaints. The knocking continued, heavy and insistent, and then suddenly, the sound changed to rattling. Someone was twisting the handle, pushing the door as if testing its strength. I grabbed Ethan's arm, and he groggily pulled out his phone to text his mom, asking if it was her. A moment later, she replied, saying she was at work. Ethan squinted at the door, then stumbled over to the window. He lifted the curtain just enough to peer out, his face pale in the morning light. "It's not anyone I know," he muttered, looking shaken. "Some tall guy. I've never seen him before." He turned to me, his expression sober. I forced myself to look. Through the narrow crack between the curtains, I saw a tall, gaunt man standing on the porch. He had hollow cheeks,
unkempt brown hair that hung limply over his forehead, and his clothes were faded and worn, like he'd been living rough.
His eyes, dark and deeply sunken, stared straight ahead, unblinking, as he slowly tilted his head, listening. I had never seen this man before, and in a town as small as ours, that was almost impossible. My skin prickled as I realized he was still trying to turn the handle, his bony fingers gripping the knob, pressing against it like he could will it open. As I backed away, the man turned his gaze directly toward the window where I was standing. I jerked back, heart pounding. He couldn't have seen me. Could he? Ethan whispered. We need to make sure he doesn't try the side door. Without another word, he bolted to the kitchen, his steps loud and uneven on the creaking floor. I stayed behind, frantically glancing out every window, searching for any sign of him moving around the house. But when I looked out again, he was gone. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. A dreadful silence settled over the house, broken only by the faint hum of the TV. Ethan returned, out of breath. Nothing on that side, he muttered. But I could see the tension in his posture. He was just as scared as I was, though he'd never admit it. I moved to the back of the house, into the tiny, cluttered kitchen, where I looked out the grimy window. I nearly dropped to the floor. The man was there, crossing our backyard, his gaze fixed straight ahead, like he knew exactly where he was going. And in the distance, barely visible through the overgrown bushes and chain-link fence, was Ethan's mother's house. Her back door was slightly ajar. She often left her garage unlocked. Worse yet, our son was staying with Ethan's stepfather and teenage sister at her house. I grabbed Ethan's arm, my voice shaking. He's heading to your mom's place. Call her. Tell her to lock the doors. Ethan fumbled with his phone, his fingers clumsy from the alcohol. As I kept watching the stranger creep through our yard, he moved with a strange, eerie calm, not rushing, but with an unsettling determination. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan's mother picked up. She sounded groggy, but told us she'd checked the garage and locked the doors, though she hadn't seen anyone. We waited, counting each second, both of us stiff with terror. 30 minutes passed in agonizing silence, but the man never returned. I tried to relax, but I was overwhelmed with a crawling dread. Who was he, and why was he here? Finally, I convinced Ethan to come with me for a drive. I wanted to search the area, see if we could spot him, and maybe call the police if he was still lurking around. But a part of me feared he was waiting, watching from some hidden spot, just waiting for us to leave so he could slip back in. We left Ethan's phone on a FaceTime call in the living room, so we could hear if there were any sounds while we were out. We drove slowly through the nearby streets, eyes scanning every corner and alleyway. Just when I was about to give up, I spotted him. He was wandering down a quiet street, his figure slightly hunched, trying the handles of parked cars and tapping on doors. My heart raced as I watched him reach one door, test it, then another, his movements calm and methodical. The man noticed us then. His head jerked up, and he stared at us, his eyes glinting with something dark and unreadable. Then, without warning, he broke into a run, heading straight back toward our street, back toward our home. I felt a surge of panic. I told Ethan to speed up, but we kept a careful distance, watching as he darted through backyards, slipping between houses like a shadow. As he rounded a corner, he stopped at a house belonging to an old man we knew, Mr.
Anders, who lived alone. The man glanced around, then calmly walked up to the door and tried the knob. My stomach churned as he pushed it open, disappearing into the house.
Ethan muttered, "I have to warn him."
Before I could stop him, he jumped out of the car and sprinted up the driveway, pounding on Mr. Anders's door.
A few agonizing moments later, Mr.
Anders and the stranger stepped onto the porch, the old man looking bewildered.
Ethan explained our encounter, and I watched as the stranger's expression twisted into a smile. He claimed he was just lost, that he was looking for his friend's house, and had confused Mr. Anders's house with his friend's. His tone was smooth, almost mocking. I shivered as I saw him slip a glance toward me, his eyes narrowing.
Mr. Anders looked uneasy, but thanked Ethan for warning him, and we hurried back to the car.
We never saw the man again, but I'll never forget that expression on his face. The way he looked at me, like he'd been waiting for me all along. For weeks after, I barely slept, always listening for that knock at the door, always expecting to see him watching from the shadows. Ethan finally fixed the front door, but that sense of unease lingered. I'll never know what he really wanted that day, or what would have happened if he'd managed to get inside. After the strange man disappeared from our lives, a haunting unease lingered. Every creak of the house and every shadow outside the window sent chills down my spine, as if he were somehow still watching, waiting for a chance to return. Days stretched into weeks, and gradually life moved on. But I could never fully shake that fear.
And that wasn't the last time terror found its way into my life.
The next encounter I had with real danger happened months later, on another night that seemed innocent at first. It was April 6th, 2019. A night I'll never forget. I was only 18 then, young, naive, and craving excitement. A few months before, I'd met a guy at my part-time job, Kyle. He had this magnetic energy that drew me in, pulling me into his world of adventure and thrill. I thought I knew him well enough, and when he invited me over to hang out at his friend's place one night, I didn't think twice. His friend's house was in a rougher part of town, but I brushed it off, eager to see Kyle. We spent hours upstairs, chatting and laughing in a small game room, completely unaware of what was about to happen.
It was just past 10:30
Strict chow shui, and we were sitting together on the couch when everything changed. A loud noise, footsteps, heavy and deliberate, came from the hallway.
I froze, my heart pounding. Before I could even process what was happening, two men stormed into the room, their faces obscured by blue bandanas.
They were holding guns. One of them spoke, his voice cold and demanding. "Where's the stash?" His words hung in the air, thick with menace. Kyle, my so-called boyfriend, just laughed, shrugging in disbelief.
Stash? What are you talking about, man? He sneered, as if they were joking.
But there was no humor in their eyes. In a flash, one of the intruders turned, grabbed a shotgun lying in the corner of the room, and slammed the stock of it into Kyle's face.
Blood splattered instantly.
I gasped, frozen in terror.
The men didn't stop there.
They ordered us downstairs, their guns pressed close to us.
My legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but I somehow managed to stumble forward. They forced us to lie on our stomachs in the living room, and one of them pinned me down with his knee digging painfully into my back. I could feel the cold metal of his gun pressing into the back of my head. Each second stretched on like an eternity. I dared to lift my head, glancing over at Kyle. Blood streamed from his face, and his eyes were wide with terror. I'd never seen him look so vulnerable. The realization struck me hard. These men weren't here to scare us. They were here to hurt us, maybe even worse. The two intruders ransacked the house, flipping tables, breaking glass, and tearing through drawers. Every time they found something valuable, they shouted to each other, throwing it into a bag. They even took my phone, leaving me stranded, helpless, and completely at their mercy. After what felt like an eternity, they left. The silence that filled the room was deafening, but I didn't dare move. I barely had time to process what had happened when suddenly I heard them return, kicking down the door and storming back inside. My heart stopped. They were back for round 2. They were furious this time, more violent, as if something had provoked them further. One of them stomped on Kyle's already bloodied face, pressing down hard as he sneered, "You're lucky we didn't shoot you." The other man loomed over me, his shadow swallowing the dim light as he tapped his gun against my head, taunting, "You better stay quiet, girl." Oh, I could barely breathe. My whole body trembled as I fought to keep my sobs silent. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that this would end. And then, as quickly as they had come, they were gone again, disappearing into the night, leaving the house in ruins. The air was thick with the smell of blood and broken glass, and Kyle's groans filled the silence. With a burst of adrenaline, I scrambled up, finding my car keys that had miraculously fallen out of my bag and onto the floor. I clutched them like a lifeline, grabbing Kyle by the arm and dragging him outside, desperate to put as much distance between us and that house as possible. We drove straight to the hospital, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my heart pounding as I looked over at Kyle, his face now a mask of blood and pain. By the time we arrived, we were both covered in blood, his and my own, from scraping against the floor and trying to shield myself. Sitting alone in the hospital waiting room, I was left to process the nightmare I had just lived. The memory of those men, their cold eyes, the feel of that gun pressed against my skull, all of it replayed in my mind, over and over. That night, I realized that my life wasn't untouchable, that there are people out there who don't hesitate to take what they want through violence and intimidation. And as I waited in the sterile hospital hallway, numb and exhausted, a deep sense of dread settled over me. I knew that, no matter how much time passed, I would never be able to forget the feeling of someone else's hands holding. In 2017, I had it all. At least, that's what it looked like from the outside. A beautiful house, a collection of luxury cars, and a thriving presence on social media where I shared every glimpse of my life. I thought I was careful, that I knew what I was doing, but it turns out I was wrong. Danger was lurking out there, hiding behind the likes,
comments, and views. One night, that danger came knocking, bringing terror to the doorstep of the life I had so openly displayed, and in the blink of an eye, my world became a nightmare. Back in 2017, I was living the life I'd always dreamed of. I had a nice house, luxury cars, and a steady career that allowed me to enjoy it all. Social media was my way of sharing my life and accomplishments, and I loved documenting every moment, from the flashy cars to the modern art hanging in my living room. What I didn't know then was how dangerous a small glimpse into my world could become. Like any enthusiastic content creator, I posted frequently on YouTube and Instagram, showing off my cars, my home, and every gadget and treasure I owned. I wasn't bragging. At least that's what I told myself. But I'd later realize how naive I'd been. I hadn't considered the darker side of the internet, the people who watched my every move, not for inspiration, but for something far more sinister. It was late one evening, around 11 or Shastapu, and I was relaxing in my living room, the glow from the TV casting shadows around me. Outside, it was pitch black. My house was surrounded by woods on two sides, and the nearest neighbor was a good mile down the road. I'd chosen this place for the privacy, never imagining it might turn into my own prison. The first sign of trouble came as a loud bang. It was so sudden and jarring that I almost dropped my phone. I looked over toward the kitchen, where the back door was. The door I never used. The door that led out to the pitch-black woods behind the house. And then, as I stared in horror, the door was kicked in, swinging open so hard that it nearly fell off its hinges. In the doorway stood 4 figures, faces obscured by masks, each one holding a gun pointed directly at me. My heart stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could hear was the pounding of my own pulse, deafening in the silence. One of them stepped forward, his gun raised, and in a voice as cold as steel, he demanded, "Give us all the keys to your cars." My hands were shaking uncontrollably as I nodded, not daring to speak. My mind raced, trying to remember where I'd left the keys. I led them down the hallway, feeling the barrel of a gun pressed into my back with each step. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from every angle. In the bedroom, I kept a small safe where I stored my most valuable items, the car keys, some cash, and a few other personal treasures. My hands fumbled as I opened the safe, and I nearly dropped the keys when I handed them over, my fingers numb with fear. I just wanted them to take what they wanted and leave, but something told me this wasn't going to end so easily. Suddenly, pain shot through the back of my head. One of the men had slammed the butt of his gun against my skull, and I collapsed to the floor, stars dancing in my vision as I tried to stay conscious. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was their shadows moving over me, grabbing my things, ransacking the room. When I came to, I was lying on my bedroom floor, my head throbbing, my carpet stained with blood. Dazed and barely able to move, I managed to glance at the clock on the nightstand. It was 4 Wananda. They had been in my house for hours, and I had been lying there, completely helpless, with no idea if they were still lurking somewhere in the darkness. In a fog of pain and terror, I reached for my phone and called 911, my voice barely a whisper, as I begged for help. The sheriff's department was miles away,
and they told me it would take at least 30 minutes for someone to reach me. I couldn't stand to be in the house any longer, not knowing if they might come back.
I stumbled to the living room, where I could see that only 2 of my cars were missing.
But the strangest part, they hadn't even taken the most expensive ones.
The sheriff finally arrived, along with an ambulance. As they loaded me into the vehicle, the sheriff leaned over and whispered, "This might not be the last time. They might come back for more."
Those words echoed in my mind as I was taken to the hospital, where they treated my concussion and stitched up the wound on my head. The thought that they could return at any time filled me with a deep, suffocating dread.
After a full day in the hospital, I returned home, but it didn't feel like home anymore.
I couldn't walk through the house without looking over my shoulder, jumping at every creak, every sound.
I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, lurking just outside, waiting for another chance.
I had a security system installed the very next day, with cameras and motion sensors covering every inch of the property.
I even put up a security gate at the end of my long driveway, but none of it felt like enough. The damage had already been done.
The invisible line between my safe, private life and the outside world had been shattered.
Over the next few months, I became paranoid, posting less and less online, withdrawing from social media entirely. I couldn't bear the thought of another stranger knowing even the smallest detail about my life. Eventually, I moved from that house, seeking a fresh start in a place where the ghosts of that night wouldn't follow me. Looking back now, I realize how reckless I had been, exposing my life for everyone to see, assuming that admiration was all I'd get in return. It took just one night to make me see the truth. You never know who's watching or what they're capable of. In June of 2023, I was just 18 years old, trying to piece my life together in a rough part of town. My girlfriend and I had managed to get our own flat, but it wasn't the safe haven we'd hoped for. Strange neighbors, constant noise, and unsettling faces made up our reality. But nothing could have prepared us for the moment we met Frank, the man who lived next door. At first, he seemed like any other resident, maybe a bit odd, but harmless. But soon, his presence would cast a dark shadow over our lives, leading us into a nightmare of fear, violence, and relentless danger. This was where it all began. In June of 2023, when I was 18, my life took a dark turn that left me haunted. I live in Scotland, and life has never been easy. At just 16, after a heated fight with my stepdad, I was kicked out of my house. The local housing agency helped place me in a flat of my own, but the building was run down and the area dangerous. This was not a place you wanted to live if you could avoid it. The tenants were mostly addicts and shady figures, and each day seemed to bring its own fresh wave of fear. I moved into the flat with my girlfriend, and together, we tried to make the best of it. But soon after moving in, strange things began happening. We started hearing rumors about a man named Frank, someone with a reputation that even the locals feared. One day, the police knocked on our door, asking if we knew where to find him. His name echoed in the hallways, spoken in hushed, cautious tones. I didn't think much of it at first. Frank was just another name to add to the list of troubled souls in the building. Then, only a few days later,
We had a knock on our door. I answered, and standing there was a man in his early 20s with a hollow look in his eyes. He introduced himself casually, saying, "I just moved in next door. Name's Frank."
Oh, my blood ran cold.
The man we'd heard rumors about, the one the police were after, was now standing right in front of us, and he was our neighbor. Over the next month, Frank would occasionally stop by to chat or invite us over. His friendly demeanor was unsettling. I could sense something lurking beneath his calm exterior. He was like a ticking time bomb, just waiting for a spark. His door was constantly being kicked down by people we didn't recognize, and his friends, people we assumed were addicts or dealers, came and went at all hours of the night. One evening, he invited us over. It was late, and my girlfriend and I had been drinking. Frank told us he was drinking too and that his ex-girlfriend was coming over. Against my better judgment, we followed him into his flat. At first, everything seemed normal. He told us stories of how his ex had once stabbed him and set fire to his belongings, killing his pets in the process. The story was horrifying, and I felt trapped, wondering what kind of person we were now sitting with in his dimly lit living room. Minutes later, Frank's ex-girlfriend, Sophie, arrived. She was small, barely over 5 feet, with a frail frame. But the second she walked in, I felt a surge of dread. She looked far younger than her years, her eyes wide and fearful. My stomach dropped as she glanced at me and said, "Wait, aren't you my friend's older brother?" She mentioned my younger sister's name, confirming my worst fear. She was only 15. This man had brought a minor to his apartment, and she looked terrified. Frank immediately grew defensive. "Oh, she's 16, he snapped, though Sophie's quiet voice confirmed otherwise. The tension in the room became unbearable, and my girlfriend and I exchanged panicked glances. We had to get out, but as I shifted to stand, Frank's demeanor changed. He grabbed Sophie by the arm, pulling her into the hallway, and we heard the sounds of shouts and shuffling. A loud thud echoed from the hallway, and moments later, they both re-entered the room. Sophie, now clearly shaken, her face pale and her body trembling. I wanted to leave, but Frank blocked our exit, rambling about some furniture he needed from downstairs. He was manic, red-faced, and furious over something none of us could understand. He stormed out, leaving us in the room with Sophie, who was on the verge of tears, begging us to take her with us when we left. We nodded, knowing we couldn't leave her behind with this man. The minutes ticked by slowly as we waited, hearts pounding, until Frank finally returned, carrying stolen furniture from another apartment. His rage had intensified, and he snapped at my girlfriend, his words dripping with hostility. That was it. We told him we were leaving, and Sophie clung to us, pleading to come along. But as we made our way to the door, Frank followed, yelling that we were stealing his girl. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back, and we were forced to pry his fingers from her. Sophie broke free, and we hurried down the hallway, desperate to escape. The horror didn't end there. Less than a week later, my girlfriend and I were sitting at home, finally beginning to breathe easily. We were about to relax with some drinks when we heard a commotion from outside. Looking through the peephole, I saw furniture, a TV, drawers, and other belongings being hurled around the building's landing. Then, out of nowhere,
Frank's door burst open, and we heard sobbing, followed by a loud crash. I peered out again and saw Sophie, bleeding from her legs, her clothes torn, her body covered in bruises. She looked desperate, like a trapped animal searching for escape. Behind her stood another man, older, shirtless, his eyes wild and unfocused. He was clearly on something. His pupils dilated, his jaw clenched in that strange, unsettling way that only comes with certain drugs. He held her tightly, dragging her toward the door, but Sophie broke free and ran toward us. We flung the door open, and she practically collapsed into my girlfriend's arms, her voice barely a whisper as she mouthed, "Help me." The man lunged forward, trying to enter our flat, but I managed to push him back, despite my smaller frame. He sneered, muttering, "All right, tough guy, calm down." With one last glare, he retreated, but the look in his eyes what made it clear. This wasn't over. We took Sophie inside, fed her, and listened as she recounted her nightmare. She told us about the abuse, the drugs, and the horrifying things Frank and his friends had done to her. It was almost too much to process, but we knew we had to help. We called the police and they took her to the hospital, but I knew we hadn't seen the last of Frank. A few days later, as if our lives weren't already shattered, I got a call at work. It was a blocked number, but the voice on the other end confirmed my worst fears.
"Sir, can you come home immediately?" the police officer asked, a chill in his tone.
I knew instantly what it meant. I arrived at the flat to find chaos. My front door had been kicked in, and my home was a wreck. Trash was strewn across the hallway, TVs shattered, jewelry stolen, and knives stabbed into our walls. But the worst part? A canvas painting of my girlfriend and her little brothers, one of whom had tragically passed away, was lying on the floor, mangled, torn, and covered in stab marks over her brother's face. Frank knew this detail, and this act of destruction was a message. We moved out that day, taking what little we had left and leaving that flat behind forever. But I still see Frank around town, lurking in the shadows, watching, as if waiting for his next chance. And every time I see him, it was supposed to be an ordinary day. Just another quiet morning alone with my older brother, while we waited for our mom to come home. We'd spent countless weekends like this, knowing every sound and shadow in the house by heart. But on this particular day, when I was only 9 years old, the familiar became terrifying. A knock at the door, unusual, but nothing to worry about, quickly turned into something much darker. Soon, our safe, cozy home became a place of fear, and my brother and I found ourselves hiding in the smallest, most secure room we could find, praying that the stranger outside wouldn't reach us. This was the day I learned how quickly innocence can be shattered. I was only 9 years old, and my older brother was 12. We'd spent so many days together, just the two of us, while our mom worked. We were supposed to go to our aunt's house that day, have lunch, and wait for our mom there. Something we did most weekends, since we were technically too young to be home alone. But this day was different. This was the day we learned how quickly our safe, cozy home could become something terrifying.
That morning, we woke up around 10:30 a.m.
I took a shower, then my brother did the same. We were nearly ready to leave, both of us brushing our teeth and chatting about the day's plans, when a knock on the door echoed through the quiet house.
It was unexpected, and we froze for a second, glancing at each other with wide eyes. Every time someone knocked on our door, it was usually a salesman or someone from the local church handing out pamphlets.
We'd learned to ignore it, letting them knock until they gave up and went away.
But this knock was different. It was loud, urgent, almost impatient.
We waited in silence, hoping whoever it was would leave.
But after a couple of minutes, curiosity got the best of me.
I sneaked over to the window and peered out, expecting to see someone walking away. But there was no one there. I let out a small sigh of relief, assuming they'd left. Little did I know the nightmare was just beginning.
As we continued getting ready, I suddenly caught sight of a shadow passing by the bathroom window. A small square of frosted glass that made everything behind it look blurry.
My heart started to pound as I stared at the shadow, my mind racing.
Had I imagined it? Maybe it was a bird or just a trick of the light. But before I could convince myself otherwise, a hand slammed against the window, clear as day.
I felt my stomach drop. My brother turned pale, and without missing a beat, he pulled out his phone and dialed the police. As he held the phone to his ear, trying to stay calm, a loud bang echoed through the house.
Someone was at the front door, forcing their way in. The sound of wood cracking filled the air, and I could feel my hands start to shake.
I could barely hear my brother whispering into the phone, giving the operator our address as quietly as he could. He turned to me, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lock the bathroom door." I scrambled to close it, my fingers fumbling as I twisted the lock, feeling as if I were moving through a nightmare. The banging continued, growing louder and more desperate, each thud vibrating through the walls. I could hear the man muttering, his voice low and angry, followed by the unmistakable sound of the front door splintering open. My brother tried to keep his voice steady, whispering into the phone, "Hello. There's someone in our house. I think they're stealing." There was a long pause. "Yes, we're at our house. Please hurry." He hung up, his face white with fear. As he motioned for me to sit down and stay quiet, I huddled against the wall, hugging my knees, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. In the silence of the bathroom, we could hear everything. Heavy footsteps stomped up and down the stairs, drawers being pulled open and slammed shut, cabinets being emptied, the sound of glass shattering. It sounded like he was tearing through every inch of our house, searching for anything he could find. My brother and I sat frozen, barely breathing, as we listened to the stranger destroying our home. And then, as if in slow motion, we heard the footsteps approaching the bathroom door. A shiver ran down my spine as I heard him try the doorknob, twisting it, testing the lock. For a moment, there was only silence, and then a harsh voice shouted, "Who's in there?" I could hear the frustration in his tone, each word
dripping with anger.
My brother clutched a metal rod we'd kept in the bathroom for repairs, holding it tightly as he braced himself against the door. The man kicked the door, once, twice, each blow making the door rattle. I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling like I might scream, but I bit down hard on my lip, fighting back tears. The room was unbearably hot, and my chest ached with each breath.
I prayed silently, hoping he would give up, that somehow he'd think the bathroom was empty.
Then, after what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped.
We listened, holding our breath as the heavy footsteps retreated, growing fainter and fainter, until finally we heard the front door creak open.
A moment of silence followed, and then the door slammed shut.
We waited for 10 minutes. 10 agonizing minutes before my brother finally unlocked the bathroom door.
We crept through the house, every nerve on edge, afraid he might still be lurking in the shadows. The living room was a wreck, with papers and books strewn across the floor, cabinets hanging open, shattered glass everywhere.
In our mother's bedroom, drawers had been emptied, and her jewelry box lay open and discarded on the floor.
Upstairs, our rooms were in a similar state, every drawer and cupboard thrown open, every inch of our private space invaded. My brother called our mom, his voice trembling as he told her everything.
She was furious and terrified, insisting we head to our aunt's house immediately. We left without looking back, making our way to safety, our hands still shaking as we walked out the door.
When we finally arrived at our aunt's, she greeted us with open arms and ice cream, trying to cheer us up. But I couldn't stop thinking about the man, the sound of his footsteps, the feeling of his presence just beyond the bathroom door.
I'd never felt so scared or so powerless in my life.
We returned home later that evening, around 5:00 p.m.
And my mom had done her best to tidy up.
She'd cleaned the shattered glass, put everything back in its place, trying to make it look like nothing had happened.
But I knew nothing would ever feel the same.
Our safe, quiet home had been violated, and the lingering sense of fear would never fully go away.
When we learned that the police had shown up 4 hours after we called, I felt a surge of anger. They took a report, but with no evidence, there was little they could do. The man was never caught. I don't think they even tried to look for him. Now, years later, I tell the story as a strange, almost surreal memory from my childhood. But in those dark, silent moments in the bathroom, crouched against the door, I'd felt real terror, a fear that left a mark on me, even now. I've always considered myself pretty fearless, living in a crowded house with 5 roommates and facing the everyday chaos of university life. I thought I knew what stress and anxiety felt like, but nothing prepared me for what happened on the one weekend I found myself completely alone in the house. At first, I was excited, a rare chance to have the place to myself, to finally enjoy some peace and quiet. But then, late that night, I heard something outside, a faint noise on the porch, a shadow moving in the darkness, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. That's when I realized I wasn't alone after all. I always thought of myself as fearless. After all, I was a 21-year-old university student, sharing a rental house with 5 roommates, and juggling the craziness of city life.
In a crowded, bustling home, I'd never had reason to feel afraid, but everything changed on one particular weekend. A weekend that started with excitement and freedom and ended in terror. For the first time ever, all 5 of my roommates were away for the weekend.
The silence was a shock at first, but soon I embraced it.
I could finally blast my music, take long showers, watch movies with the volume cranked up, and walk around the house without worrying about anyone else.
That Friday night, I grabbed a glass of wine and settled into the couch, wrapped up in a blanket, thrilled to have the whole place to myself.
It was around 10 p.
And I had just finished some assignments and settled in to watch a horror movie, which, ironically, now feels like foreshadowing.
As I lay sprawled out on the couch, a faint sound came from the porch. It was barely noticeable. A slight scrape, like something moving across the wooden boards. I brushed it off at first, chalking it up to the wind, or maybe even a stray animal.
We'd had a fox wander around before, so I wasn't too concerned.
But then I heard it again, this time louder. A deliberate, dragging sound.
I muted the TV, suddenly hyper-aware of the quiet around me.
My heart started to pound, but I forced myself to stand up, walk over to the window, and peek out. Nothing. The porch was empty, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlight. I breathed a sigh of relief, feeling a bit silly, shaking my head. I turned to head back to the couch when... crash! A sharp, deafening sound tore through the silence, and I spun around to see a chunk of cement lying on the kitchen floor. Shards of glass scattered around it. The kitchen window had been shattered from the outside. I gasped, instinctively clutching my hands to my chest. My mind raced as I tried to process what was happening. Who would do this? Why would someone throw a chunk of cement through the window? I felt a surge of anger, mixed with a wave of fear that sent shivers down my spine. I took a shaky breath and tried to gather my thoughts. Foolishly, I took a step toward the front door, thinking I might confront whoever had done this. But then, a voice of reason screamed at me to stop. I turned around and locked the door again, my hands trembling as I bolted it shut. I stumbled to the back door and checked the lock, pressing my weight against it just to make sure. But my mind was racing, filled with every worst-case scenario. Then, something my grandmother used to say floated into my head. If someone tries to get into your house, turn off the lights. You know your own home better than they do. It was as if she were whispering in my ear, urging me to act. I reached for the light switch, plunging the living room into darkness. My hands were shaking, but I managed to turn off the TV as well, my heart pounding so loud it felt like the intruder might hear it. The silence was overwhelming. I crept up the stairs, step by step, forcing myself not to make a sound. Every shadow seemed to stretch and loom, twisting into strange shapes in the dark. I reached my bedroom and locked the door behind me, the walls of the room closing in on me as I sat there, listening. In the silence, I heard the unmistakable sound of the front doorknob rattling. Whoever was out there hadn't given up. They were trying to break in. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find for protection, a hockey stick I'd kept from childhood. My hands were trembling so badly that I wrapped pink duct tape around the handle, just to keep my grip steady. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear, the thumping of my pulse nearly drowning out the sound of the doorknob jiggling, the faint rustle of footsteps moving around the house. As I stood there waiting, clutching my makeshift weapon, my phone suddenly felt like dead weight in my pocket. I pulled it out and dialed emergency services, keeping the call on speaker as I whispered into the phone. The operator's voice, calm and steady, was my only lifeline as I explained what was happening, my words stumbling over each other in my panic. The operator told me to stay hidden and assured me that help was on the way, but time seemed to stretch on forever. I huddled in the corner of the room, listening to the silence outside. Every second felt like an hour, and I was sure the intruder would burst through the door at any moment. I could still hear the faint sound of footsteps outside, moving along the porch, tapping the windows, as if they were testing each one, searching for another way in. Finally, red and blue lights flashed through the window, casting strange, flickering shadows across the room. There was a knock on the door downstairs. A different knock this time, calm and rhythmic. I peered out the window and saw the unmistakable lights of a police car. Relief flooded over me, and I felt my body go weak as I realized I was finally safe. I went downstairs, letting the officers in, my voice shaking as I explained everything that had happened. One of the officers, a kind woman with a tattoo peeking out from under her sleeve, stayed with me while I tried to clean up the shattered glass. She reassured me, told me I'd done everything right. But her words felt distant, like they were reaching me through a fog. My brother arrived not long after, insisting that I come stay with him for the rest of the weekend. I didn't argue. I just wanted to get away from the house, from the darkness and the feeling that someone was watching me. The days that followed were filled with anxiety and sleepless nights. I started having nightmares, waking up in cold sweats, with the memory of those footsteps on the porch haunting me. I couldn't bear the silence of my own room, the shadows that seemed to lurk around every corner. Finally, I went to the doctor and started on anxiety medication to help with the nightmares and sleeplessness. The medicine helped a bit, but the memories were harder to shake. Now, I'm back at the house, my roommates filling the place with noise and life again. But I'm not the same person I was before that weekend. The sounds that I used to ignore now make me tense up, my heart racing with each creak and rustle. And It was supposed to be a quiet, simple evening. My parents were out of town, and for the first time my brother and I were left alone in the house for a few days. We'd always felt safe in our small, peaceful town, a place where people didn't even bother locking their doors. But as the night wore on, that sense of security began to crumble. Strange shadows flickered outside, headlights lingered on our street, and an unsettling silence filled the house. By the time we realized we weren't alone, it was already too late. What followed was a night of sheer terror, a night that changed the way I looked at our home forever. This happened several years ago, in the sleepy, isolated town where I grew up. I was just a teenager, and my older brother and I were finally old enough that our parents felt comfortable leaving us alone for a few days. Our town was small and quiet, the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked, where we knew every neighbor by name. Safety was something we took for granted, until that night. The first night started off peacefully. My brother and I spent the evening watching movies and ordering pizza, thrilled with the freedom of being alone. As the hours crept toward midnight, he went upstairs to sleep, leaving me in the living room to finish a show. The house was silent, the kind of silence you only notice when it's dark outside, and every sound feels amplified. I could hear the soft hum of the fridge, the gentle tick of the clock, and then something else. Headlights flashed briefly through the front window. I glanced up, assuming it was just a car passing by, but the lights didn't move. They stayed, casting strange, flickering shadows across the living room walls. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine as I realized the car was idling right outside our house. For several long minutes, the car didn't move. It just sat there, silent, except for the faint rumble of the engine. I couldn't see the driver's face through the glare of the headlights, but I could sense them watching, staring straight at our front door. My heart started pounding, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I decided to ignore it, and I slowly drew the curtain shut, blocking out the eerie light. Eventually, the headlights faded, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But the peace didn't last. About 20 minutes later, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel, and this time, I saw the same headlights creeping down our street once more. They slowed as they approached our house, then idled just a little further down the road. It was as if the driver wanted to keep an eye on us, without being too obvious. Feeling uneasy, I ran upstairs to my brother's room and woke him up. I told him what was happening, hoping he'd laugh it off and tell me I was imagining things. But his face turned serious, and he followed me downstairs, peeking cautiously through the curtain. The car was still there. This time, it parked at the end of our driveway, the headlights cutting through the darkness like two cold, unblinking eyes. My brother's face paled, and he locked the front door, something we never did in our town. He grabbed his phone, his fingers shaking as he hovered over the keypad. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the car pulled away, disappearing down the road. We watched until the red taillights vanished into the darkness. My brother let out a shaky laugh, trying to lighten the mood. It was probably just someone who got lost, he said, though his voice didn't sound as confident as his words. But neither of us could shake the feeling that something wasn't right here. Hours later, long after I'd fallen asleep, I was jolted awake by a noise downstairs. A faint, rhythmic sound, like the back door rattling on its hinges. I froze, straining to listen. My brother, who had slept in my room after the strange encounter, was already awake, his eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. We both crept to the top of the stairs, careful not to make a sound. From our vantage point, we could just barely see the back door. The doorknob was jiggling, turning back and forth, as if someone was trying to get in. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears, as we watched in terrified silence. "Stay here," my brother whispered, his voice barely audible. He grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer as we made our way down the stairs, keeping to the shadows. The rattling stopped for a moment, and then we heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. Heavy, deliberate steps, pacing back and forth in front of the door. My brother and I backed into the kitchen,
hiding behind the counter. Every nerve in my body was on edge, and I clutched his arm, holding my breath as we listened. Then, we heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft, metallic click. The lock on the front door was being tested, each slow twist sending chills down my spine. My brother's hand tightened around the knife, his face pale as we exchanged a horrified glance. We knew we had locked the door, but the thought of someone trying to open it, just a few feet away from where we hid, was unbearable. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, a window breaking. We stifled our gasps as shards of glass scattered across the floor. The sound sharp and jarring in the silence of the house. Whoever was outside had finally found their way in. We crawled toward the back door, moving as silently as we could, praying that whoever was inside wouldn't notice us. My brother reached for the doorknob, but then we heard the heavy footsteps entering the living room, moving toward the kitchen. The intruder's breathing was low and rough, each step slow and deliberate, as if they were savoring the hunt. The footsteps paused, and I could sense the intruder standing just a few feet away from us, separated only by the thin wall of the kitchen counter. My brother squeezed my hand, signaling for us to make a break for it. We pushed the back door open and slipped outside, the cool night air hitting us as we sprinted into the yard. My brother helped me climb over the fence, and we ran down the street, our breaths coming in sharp, ragged gasps. We didn't stop until we reached a well-lit main road. Only then did we dare to look back, our eyes searching the shadows for any sign of the stranger who had broken into our home. The house loomed in the distance, dark and silent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been inside was still watching us from the darkness. When we finally called the police, it took them nearly an hour to arrive. By the time we returned with them, our home was empty, the broken window a chilling reminder of what had happened. A few valuables were missing, but that wasn't what haunted me. It was the thought of that figure, moving through our house in the dark, so close to where we'd been hiding, and the knowledge that, for those few terrifying moments, we had been completely at their mercy. Since that night, I've never felt the same in our home. The shadows seem darker, the creaks louder, and every night, it was supposed to be a quiet night, just another evening alone in our cozy little home. My husband was out, and I was settling into the familiar silence of our small unit. But then came the knock, a strange, unexpected sound that echoed through the house. I thought it was harmless, just someone stopping by, maybe a neighbor or a delivery at the wrong door. But as I approached, something felt wrong. In the dim light of the back door window, I could make out two shadowy figures. They claimed they were from the cable company, but their voices, their insistence, the way they gripped the doorknob, it sent a chill down my spine. That's when I realized this wasn't an ordinary visit. Several years ago, I had a night I'll never forget. A night that forever changed the way I looked at my own front door. My husband and I were renting a unit in a fourplex, a cozy little place nestled at the edge of town. It was the kind of neighborhood where people rarely visited unannounced. In fact, we almost never used the back door, as it led up a narrow staircase around the side of the building, an inconvenient entrance that no one ever bothered with. Our friends and neighbors always came to the main door out front. It was early evening, and my husband was out working late. The house was quiet. I was curled up on the couch, lost in a book, when a knock echoed through the house.
I froze. The knock hadn't come from the front door, the one we actually used.
No, it came from the back door, a place where no one ever came.
My heart skipped a beat, but I took a deep breath and reminded myself that it could just be a neighbor. I approached the door, cautious, and peeked out the small window. Standing on the other side of the door were two men. They looked ordinary enough at first glance, tall, wearing work jackets. But there was something unsettling in the way they stood, perfectly still, waiting. One of them reached up and tapped the window again, making me jump. "Hello!" I called out, keeping my voice steady. And so, those are the stories that still haunt me. 8 encounters, each one a reminder of how quickly life can shift from ordinary to terrifying.
Every sound in the night, every stranger's knock, every moment of isolation. These memories linger, making shadows seem darker and silence feel heavier.
As I look back, I realize that even the most mundane days can hold hidden dangers.
The sense of security I once took for granted has been replaced by caution, an awareness of how close fear and vulnerability always are.
For now, the silence has returned. The shadows have settled, and life has resumed its familiar pace. But deep down, I know that the peace never lasts forever. Another knock, another shadow, another story is always just around the corner. Until next time, stay safe and stay watchful. See you again soon.
The man closest to the door leaned closer, his face partially obscured by shadows.
"Evening, ma'am. We're with the cable company, Bresnan. We're doing maintenance in the area and need to come in to check your lines," he said, his tone flat, almost mechanical. A shiver ran down my spine. We hadn't had any issues with our cable, and no one from the company had called about maintenance. I tried to keep my voice steady.
We haven't had any problems with the service.
Is there an issue?" The man's expression didn't change. He gripped the doorknob and gave it a slow twist, testing the lock. "We're checking every unit," he insisted, his voice now colder, sharper.
"Just let us in for a moment, and we'll be out of your way." I swallowed, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. "If there's an issue, I can call Bresnan to confirm. Can you give me your names and badge numbers?" There was a pause. The men exchanged a glance, and I could feel a shift in their posture, a slight edge of frustration. The one at the door leaned in, his voice dropping lower.
"Ma'am, we don't have time for this. Just let us in. We're on a deadline."
He gave the doorknob another twist, harder this time, and I could see his grip tighten, his knuckles turning white.
My pulse quickened as fear started creeping into my thoughts.
Why were they so insistent? And why hadn't they even knocked on the front door? I tightened my grip on the doorframe, fighting the urge to scream, to run, to do anything to break the thick silence between us.
"I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice firm.
"I really can't let you in without some identification."
For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the man let go of the doorknob, taking a step back, but his gaze stayed locked on me.
You're making a big mistake," he muttered, his voice dripping with something close to anger. His eyes were dark, intense, filled with an unsettling coldness.
The two men turned slowly, their figures disappearing down the narrow staircase into the night.
My hands were shaking as I watched them go. A wave of relief mingled with lingering dread washing over me.
I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just narrowly avoided something terrible. I ran to the front door, double-checking the lock, and then hurried to call my husband.
He didn't answer, so I left a shaky voicemail, telling him what had happened and asking him to come home as soon as he could.
But I couldn't sit still. I grabbed my phone and called the cable company, waiting anxiously as I was put on hold. After what felt like forever, a representative finally came on the line. I explained the situation, describing the two men, their claim of being from the company. The rep's response made my blood run cold.
"No, ma'am," she said slowly. "We don't have anyone in your area tonight."
There's no scheduled maintenance, and we certainly wouldn't send anyone without prior notice. Sue. The words echoed in my mind, filling me with a sickening dread. I thanked her and hung up, but the silence that followed was worse than before.
My mind was racing, 1,000 terrifying scenarios playing out in my head.
Who were those men? And what would they have done if I had let them in? For the rest of the night, I stayed in the living room, every light in the house blazing, jumping at every sound, every creak. Shadows seemed to twist and stretch, growing larger, darker. I kept glancing toward the back door, half expecting to see them standing there again, watching me through the window. When my husband finally came home, I told him everything, the fear in my voice barely masked. He took it seriously, double-checking every lock and even calling the police to report the incident. They said they'd send someone to patrol the area, but we both knew they probably wouldn't find anything. Those men were long gone, but the memory of that night stayed with me. For weeks, every time I heard a knock at the door, I'd freeze. A flash of that cold stare and twisting doorknob haunting my mind. I never felt quite safe again, knowing how close I'd come to opening that door to strangers, to letting something dark into our lives.